Hello and welcome to episode 17 of the Monday Night Review. Today's episode is not for the faint-hearted, and that's not just because the crimes are horrendous, but if you look at the pictures, which I'll upload to our social media, you won't sleep for a week. Trust me. This is another one where I'm going to have to apologise in advance for my pronunciation, which you'll understand when we get to that bit in a minute. So today, I'm going to tell you about the Beast of Jersey. Now, for years when I heard about this, I assumed it was Jersey as in New Jersey in the USA. But no, it's much closer to home in the Channel Islands. So for those who don't know, the Channel Islands are an archipelago in the English Channel off the French coast of Normandy. Technically, they're not part of the UK, though they are under the protection of the Crown, and residents speak English. Jersey is the largest of these islands and part of the bailiwick of Jersey, which includes the main island of Jersey and several other uninhabited islands. The language, as I say, is English, but many of the place names and surnames are French, hence my apology for pronunciation. For those of you who are fans of a good old ITV drama, you might remember the 1980s show Bergerac, which was set in Jersey. Also starred my favourite, John Nettles. Also the lovely talking cows in the advert for butter. Sadly, Jersey is no stranger to horrible tales of abuse. Jimmy Savile was a regular visitor, but we're not going to go into that. Now, for this story we're looking at today is just a 13-year reign of terror that began way back in 1957. So let's get into it. So, November 1957. A 29-year-old nurse is waiting for her bus in the Mont-à-l'Abbé area. Already bad pronunciation there. She's attacked by a man wearing a scarf over his face, a big coat, and using a fake Irish accent. He beats her over the head, drags her into a field, and attacks and sexually assaults her, leaving her really badly injured and traumatised, but alive. 4 months later, in March 1958, a woman walking home from the bus stop in the Trinity area of the island has a rope put around her neck before being dragged into the field and raped. In July of that year, a 31-year-old woman suffered what was now the signature of this violent attacker: rope around the neck, dragged into a field and raped. August 1959. A young woman endures the same, and in St. Martin's in October of the same year, a 28-year-old is dragged into a field with a rope around her neck, but she's able to fight off the attacker and flee. Each victim was able to give a description of the attacker, and it was determined that they were all attacked by the same man. He's in his 40s, fake Irish accent, about 5'6", musty smelling. I've written bloke next to that because it's just, I don't want to trivialise this whole situation, but it's just making it worse, isn't it? It's when you read about or hear about, I don't know, the Night Stalker and his terrible breath and terrible teeth, and you think, these women are enduring enough without your horrendous smells. Some say that he wore a rope around his waist, and in some cases he uses this to bind their hands. He also always did the same thing: rope around the neck, dragged to a field, would rape and assault them, and then I think he leaves them in the field, but later on he kind of returns people to places. It's very odd. The local press dubs him the Beast of Jersey, and the attacks completely changed the character of the island, and women were terrified to walk at night. If this wasn't bad enough, in 1960 it got worse. The attacks became more frequent, with increased violence, and now taking place inside as well as outside. The Beast also widened his choice of victim. In the early hours of the 14th of February 1960, a boy awoke to find a man wearing a mask and a wig who'd climbed in through his bedroom window. He had a rope placed around his neck and was taken outside and raped before being taken home. A month later, a 25-year-old woman was given a lift by a man claiming to be a doctor on his way to pick up his wife. She gets into the car and then she realises he's wearing gloves, a duffel coat and hat. She can't really see him properly and it's a really odd way to be dressed. He drives her to a field, ties her hands above her head, drags her out of the car, rapes her. He then puts her back into the car and she manages to escape from it while it's moving and she starts screaming and he flees. Later that month, a woman who lives in a remote area with her daughter is awakened by a phone ringing. She goes downstairs to answer it, but no one speaks and she just hears nothing and then a click and the dial tone, so she assumes it's a wrong number. So she goes back to bed and an hour or so later she hears a noise downstairs. So she goes to investigate. She switches the light on the landing, goes down the stairs, and as she reaches the bottom of the stairs, the lights go off. She realises there's someone in the house. So she goes to grab the phone, but the phone is dead. The line's been cut. And it's then that she's confronted by the figure of a man who grabs her, demands money, threatens to kill her. And then her 14-year-old daughter starts to come down the stairs to see what the noise is. He drops the mother, goes for the daughter, and the mother takes this opportunity to run for the house, to go to the nearby farmhouse to raise the alarm. When she returns with the people from the farmhouse, they find the daughter brutally raped, having had a rope tied around her neck. I mean, I don't know. It's that awful thing of, do you leave your daughter to be attacked by this man so that you can go and get help, or do you try and take him on? It's awful. In July of the same year, a 14-year-old girl awakes to find a man in her bedroom wearing a strange mask. Luckily, she screams really loudly and he jumps out of the window. But in July, an 8-year-old boy is abducted from his doorstep, taken to a field where he's raped, and then he's returned to the doorstep. Then there are no further attacks until 1961, when a 12-year-old boy is taken and molested in a field. An attack of an 11-year-old boy happens in the parish of St Saviour in March of the same year, and a brutal rape of an 11-year-old girl in St Martin's happens in April. This has now been going on for 3 years, and the police have no leads. Suspicions for the attacks initially fell on an eccentric agricultural worker and fisherman, Alphonse Legasloy, who is arrested, but they release him because there's no evidence. Public suspicion remains so strong, however, that his cottage is burnt down. And fearing for his life, he flees to another island where he lives in self-imposed exile for 14 years. He's then almost immediately cleared of suspicion because as soon as he's gone, the attacks from the beast just carry on. And he's not even on the island, but he still chooses to stay away. The Jersey police have no choice. They call in Scotland Yard, who send in Detective Superintendent Jack Mannings, who's a bit of a hero of the murder squad. And he tells islanders to turn detective, report anything suspicious. And he also gives a detailed description of the beast to all media outlets. This is a really small island. There are 33,000 people on the island at the time. They initially interview and take fingerprints from every person there with a criminal record. So they believe that somebody must recognise this description. So they just make sure that everyone knows what to look out for. So what do we know about the beast so far? He always struck at night, and up until this point had only been active on moonlit weekends between the hours of 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. He knew the island well, particularly the eastern area. He's described by his victims as being between 40 to 45, about 5'6" tall, with a moustache and of medium build. He's usually described as wearing a thigh-length jacket or raincoat which smells really musty, a peaked cap and gloves. His face was always covered, either with a mask or a scarf covering the lower part of his face. He carried a torch with him during the attacks, and his methods followed a distinct pattern. His victims were selected carefully, and the usual method of entry was a bedroom window. Once inside, the man was fast and silent, and usually blindfolded, and then tied up the victim's hands. In each case, a rope is placed around the victims' necks. They're then taken to a nearby field, assaulted, and then returned home. The assailant spoke a lot during the attacks with a soft voice, fake Irish accent. He mentions having a wife, a dead mother who died of alcoholism, and that he's killed people before, and he makes a point of saying that he's either dropped his cigarettes or his cigarette lighter. Jersey's about 46 square miles in total. It's believed that someone would recognise something about this person. Every possible man was looked at. All men with a criminal record were questioned and interviewed, but he's still not found. But following the arrival of Jack Mannings, he goes quiet, and there are no more attacks for 2 years. He's not gone for good, though. In April 1963, a 9-year-old boy was taken and attacked and then returned home. In November, another attack took place. This time it's an 11-year-old boy. Then there's nothing until July 1964, when a 10-year-old girl was attacked in Trinity, and in August it was a 16-year-old boy. Then no more attacks for 2 years. In 1966, Jersey police received a letter out of the blue. It read, "My dear sir, I think that it is just the time to tell you that you are just wasting your time, as every time I have done what I always intended to do, and remember, it will not stop at this, but I will be fair to you and give you a chance. I have never had much of this life, but I intend to get everything I can now. I have always wanted to do the perfect crime. I have done this, but this time let the moon shine very bright in September, because this time it must be perfect. Not one, but two. I am not a maniac by a long shot, but I like to play with you people. You will hear from me just before September, and I will give you all the clues. Just see if you can catch me. Yours very sincerely, Wait and See." It's always really hard to tell with these letters whether they're from the perpetrator or not, as we know from Jack the Ripper and other celebrity cases. But the savage rape of a 15-year-old girl in August seems to back up the promise made in the letter. This attack is the same as previous ones, but this time the victim has long, strange scratches down her torso that they can't work out what made them. And there are no more attacks for them for the rest of the decade. But he's back in August of 1970 when a 13-year-old boy was awakened at his home by a torch shining in his face. He was made to get out of bed, taken to a field behind the house. The attacker then placed his raincoat on the ground, made the boy remove his pyjamas, and he raped him. The boy was then returned home and warned to keep quiet, otherwise his mother and father would be harmed, but he raised the alarm the following morning. The boy was incredibly distressed and dishevelled and offered a description of what happened, and that was now all too common to the police. This time the assailant had black, spiky hair and a terrifying mask on. The boy also had the same scratches on his face and body as found on the victim of the 1966 attack. Most of the island was interviewed. Nearly 30,000 people in all were spoken to on the hunt for the beast, but he wasn't caught. But as with so many serial offenders, things are about to get trafficky. By that I don't mean human trafficking. I mean that a load of serial killers have been got for the most stupid traffic violations. I mean Ted Bundy, Yorkshire Ripper, William Suff. On the 10th of July 1971, police officers John Riseborough and Tom McGinn were on patrol duties focused on the St Helier area. At 11:45 p.m, they were waiting at some traffic lights when a small Morris 1100 saloon car shot past them at high speed, jumping the lights and driving erratically. They chased the car for a long time. It was sideswiping other cars, driving on the wrong side of the road, and it eventually hit a hedge and rather fittingly ended up in a field. They pursued it, writing off their patrol car in the process and then having to chase the man on foot. They eventually tackled him and took him into the station, and it was only then that they realised quite what they'd arrested. The man was wearing an old raincoat. The musty smell struck both the officers. The raincoat had 1-inch nails protruding from both the shoulders and the lapels of the coat. And he was wearing cloth bands around each wrist, which also had 1-inch nails sticking through. He's wearing old trousers tucked into socks, carpet slippers, and woolen gloves. A strange sight, as you can well imagine, but the suspect emptied his pockets and it got even stranger. So, out of the pockets came a torch with black tape covering most of the front so that only a narrow shaft of light came through. 2 lengths of cord, a peaked woolen cap, several empty cigarette packets, rolls of adhesive tape, and a black wig with stiff, spiky hair. With mounting suspicion that they'd found the beast of Jersey, their suspicion was confirmed when they removed the final item from the raincoat, which was a homemade, horrendous mask. The man they'd arrested was 46-year-old Edward John Louis Paisnell, a native of Jersey who came from a wealthy family. He was married with a daughter and had 2 stepchildren. He's a well-known building contractor who worked across the island. He did have a criminal record, but this was an arrest for stealing food to redistribute to poor families during German occupation in the Second World War. And his marriage was essentially over. Apparently, his low sex drive contributed to its demise. And by the time the attack started, he was living in an annex attached to his house. He also apparently had at least 1 girlfriend at the time of arrest. So the interview begins, and they ask him about his strange outfit. He claims that he's going to an orgy and that the nails in his coat are a defence against anyone attacking him. He refused to comment on the wig and mask, and he had sticky tape marks on his face that corresponded with the sticky tape on the mask and on the wig. So he'd clearly worn it at some point that evening. He was locked up overnight and they went to search his house. In his bedroom, which was in the annex of the house, was a secret room that he'd had built on, and when they opened it, it smelled incredibly musty, which the police noted, but quite honestly, single men living on their own in a room, it can get a bit musty in there. Inside the room, this secret room, hung several items of old clothing, including a blue tracksuit and an old fawn raincoat, homemade wigs and hats, and false eyebrows. There's a camera hanging on a hook, and several photographs of different houses, some of which are where attacks had taken place. All were homes where young children lived, and it explained how he managed to enter the houses through the correct window and without waking the families. There were also several items of black magic paraphernalia, a homemade altar, a sizable library about black magic rituals and the occult, and very large curved wooden sword hanging on the wall. This was all the proof they needed that they'd caught the beast of Jersey. Paisner was eventually charged on 13 counts, including rape, indecent assault, and sodomy against 6 victims, with all but 1 being a minor. His trial in November 1971 revealed an obsession with black magic, and with Gilles de Rais, the man who many believe is the real-life inspiration for the French fairy tale villain Bluebeard. If you don't know who he is, he has this horrible room where he kind of murders his wives, and each new wife is told not to go in to the room. Each wife gets overcome with curiosity and goes in, and once she's seen what's in there, the same thing happens to her. He's basically the most horrendous man. I'm sure All Killer No Filler did an episode on it. And actually I listened to it whilst driving and I felt really sick. Paisner himself claimed to be a descendant of Gilles de Rais, although he never explained what motivated him to commit the horrendous attacks. Some believe he was trying to sort of mimic Gilles de Rais, but he never murdered anyone as far as we know. So when questioned, he gives evasive and sort of babbling answers and just talks about curses and covens and black magic. So though he's odd, there's no way for him to plead insanity or that it's not premeditated. The photos of the houses were obviously earmarked for his next attacks. He had written to the police. His wife identifies his handwriting, and the masks designed to disguise himself and terrify his victims. He's got lots of empty cigarette packets lying around, and during his attacks he'd mentioned cigarettes and smoking, which are one of many red herrings as he's a non-smoker. He's also just one of 13 men on the island who refused to give his fingerprints throughout the investigation. On the 29th of November 1971, it took just 38 minutes for a guilty verdict to be reached against Paisnell for all charges. And he was taken away to await sentencing. He was sentenced 2 weeks later, where he stands completely impassive to be sentenced to 30 years in prison, where he then goes to Winchester prison. You know, I love a Hampshire connection, wasn't expecting it here. Paisnell launched an unsuccessful appeal in September 1972, where he was told he would have to serve his whole sentence, but he was released in 1991, 10 years early, after being a model prisoner, and he returned to Jersey. The locals, however, were not pleased to see him, and he eventually moved to the Isle of Wight, where he died of a heart attack 3 years later in 1994. Since his death, there have been unsubstantiated reports that he was involved in child abuse concerned with the notorious Eau de la Garenne Children's Home, which is linked to Jimmy Savile as well. Papers that were released during the independent Jersey Care Inquiry revealed him to be a regular visitor there, and had previously heard evidence that he prowled the halls and rooms of the La Préférence home, which was run by his mother-in-law and his wife Joan during the 1960s, and he'd do this in a terrifying mask. Some say that they knew someone would be moving through the crawl spaces at night, and they later realised this must have been him. He often did handiwork around the home. Loads of people have come forward and said that he used to watch the children sleep, and he allegedly abused other children there. A former resident of the home in the 1960s, known only as Mr. D, gave evidence saying that Paisnell had on numerous occasions crept into the home at night through the windows, dressed in a raincoat and gloves, and that he'd used chloroform to drug children and remove them from their beds to abuse in his signature fashion. Though it's originally thought that he stopped short of murdering any of his victims, there are children missing from the two children's homes mentioned, and it's believed that by some that he's the person that's responsible. We know it's rare for serial offenders to stop doing what they're doing, whether it's sexual attacks or murders. And so when the Beast of Jersey attacks stopped, was it because he's able to get his thrills from these victims in the children's home? I'm wondering. We see that his attacks stop for 1 or 2 years at a time, which just seems really unusual and often doesn't happen. It was what was so weird about the Zodiac just stops, and the Golden State Killer just stops. It's very unusual. So I'm wondering if actually it becomes too dangerous for him to be taking his victims from their homes or from the street, but he knows he has access to them because his wife runs a children's home. It doesn't end there. In 2006, former detectives who'd investigated the murder of 20-year-old Finnish au pair Tuula Hoek on New Year's Eve in 1966 named Paisnell as their chief suspect. She was bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument in a field in St. Clement. And it seems unlikely that someone who likes to hit people over the head never took it too far. Someone who idolises a murderer who is happy to cut up bodies and murders hundreds of people doesn't himself murder anyone, and whether occasionally he does and just happens to be able to get rid of the bodies in a way that they're not found, which is easier to do if you're surrounded by sea, I suppose. For the whole investigation into the children's home, they found children's teeth buried, they found shackles hidden, and as I said, there are children that just disappeared. So it could be that we only know about the people who survived these attacks. But what an absolutely horrific man. I don't know what I would do. Don't know. There's no evidence of what happened to the people on the Isle of Wight when he moved there. It must just be so horrific. Speaking of which, last week, Colin Pitchfork was released, murderer of 2 children, and the person we talk about in episode 7, the accidental discovery of genetic fingerprinting and Colin Pitchfork. If you haven't listened to that, go and have a listen. It's a quickie. So he's just been released. I can't remember what his pseudonym is, but I would feel pretty unhappy if he was living near me with my young girls. And that is the end of today's episode. Fairly horrific, I'm afraid. And honestly, the disguises he wore are the stuff of nightmares. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I always love to hear your recommendations. You can email us at themondaynightrevue@gmail.com and find us on Instagram and Facebook, where we're the Monday Night Revue. Remember that review is spelled REVUE. And until next week, stay safe, be kind, and always check the back seat before you drive.